We are back. Hey, it's Drive Safe Dave here at BCB Live, the safest station in the nation. Zach Miller, head of media and development at trucktrailer.com. All right, Zach, what's going on in New York City right now?
Well, there's always a lot going on in New York City. It's one of the joys and aggravations of being in New York City, I suppose. But what we're looking at in 2023, and you mentioned it a little bit with the new emission standards coming down from the feds, is there's a lot of focus to how do we make freight movement more efficient and more sustainable. And New York City is pretty unique among even dense urban areas across the country. New York City is so heavily reliant on trucks to deliver freight. Trucks deliver almost just a shade under 90% of all freight in New York City. The national average, as we know, is closer to 75% of freight. So it's heavily reliant on trucks. It is a dense area. There are a lot of different road users, many of whom happen to be vulnerable road users, cyclists, electronic cyclists, pedestrians alike. So the question becomes, how do we accommodate this freight? How do we plan for projected increases in freight volumes while maybe trying to have smaller, more efficient vehicles? So one of the things we're looking to do with the Trucking Association of New York, with City DOT, and a couple of other stakeholders, is it possible to build out these sort of micro hub distribution plans? And in a micro hub distribution plan, what we're trying to think is a truck can come, sort of unload either at the curb, or maybe there'll be a building provided to them. And then that trucking company will contract with maybe an e-cargo bike company or some other smaller mode of transportation to finish out that delivery, that sort of last mile or last half a mile, so to speak. Is that feasible in communities? That's one of the things we're trying to figure out. In 2023, we're also trying to figure out just exactly how electrification would work. How would fleets that operate pretty substantial tractor trailers, how would they incorporate electric vehicles into their operations? And that's holistically, right? It's not just the truck itself, but it's the maintenance of the truck, being able to recharge that truck. Would there be any sort of special delivery needs from the receiver point of view? So those are two pilots that we're building out in 2023 to really learn how these transitions could potentially work.
You know, Zach, and as we talk about this, and I'm sitting here listening to it's a whole lot more complicated in the sense of trying to get these micro distributors to go together. To me, it's like, okay, let's have 25 different plumbing companies. You can't run 25 different sets of pipes 20, different companies running all different kind of plumbing. They kind of have to work together to try to figure out who's going to pay and how we're going to, the income's going to be derived. Because if I'm bringing my dog food, let's just, right, you also want the guy to bring the charcoal briquettes, and you also want the guy to bring, the linens, right? And then the other guy bring the oranges. But, but you're going to want it all put in a simple truck. It makes it a little bit harder than people think of when they think of a redistribution center, correct?
That's exactly it. That's exactly right. And I think that's why it's so important that the Trucking Association of New York is so heavily involved in this, because it is a little bit like matchmaking, right? It's a little bit like, you want to even call it online dating. It's not just something where a company is going to feel comfortable taking everything off the back of their truck, putting it on the street and saying, well, some app, like I could go on an app and some cyclist or something could come and take it. Absurd. We know that's not how deliveries happen. We know how intricate the delivery system is, and each vendor, as you said, has their own sort of set of needs, which is to say nothing about the liability of the company if something happens to the shipping, or who's responsible from that trade-off. Is it secure? What about weather conditions? I mean, we know we saw the blizzards and the winter conditions. Well, New York City has a pretty rough winter climate. So how will all that be protected? These are, of course, solvable issues, but they have to be factored in the planning phase for this to yield any sort of success. So that's why, at least I'm glad New York City, there are many advocates that want this to be like, do it now, do it more, but I have to give the city a lot of credit. It looks like they're doing it the right way, small scale, pilot program, get the legacy fleets involved early, get legitimate cargo bike companies involved, not just some person who maybe owns a bike and has an app or something. We're not doing that. Not at the start, at least. We need to make sure that this entire system can run the way freight is delivered currently, safely, efficiently, properly. So I think that, and I hope this quote doesn't come back to bite me, but I do think the city is doing this right at the start, and that's why we're excited about building out one or two of these pilots.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Is also the city and the state also working to create tax incentives also to help fund these ideas? Because I tell you what, if this works here, this would work just about anywhere else. It's a little bit flatter and a little bit, a little bit wider.
Exactly, and that's why we actually partnered with an urban planning consulting group, EA Creative Consulting, who said that exact same thing, which is we have to start it in New York, get it right in New York, but if we do that, it can be transferred all across the nation, especially in these urban cores. The incentive part is such a great question because a lot of times there's this misconception of the industry that the industry has so much money that fleets have, anything is just the cost of doing business and fleets can eat it and none of this should be a problem. And we all know that's nonsense. The industry operates on razor thin margins. Pennies, really, pennies on the dollar. There are a couple of outliers, of course, like anything in America, but really it is a razor thin industry. So in terms of the incentives, that's something that we have to go back to the city and say, let's build it out in that way. And I think what might make sense, and again, these are early conversations, but I think what might make sense is instead of sort of having these itemized lists where they have parking tickets or metered parking or like a city specific tax, things like that, maybe there could just be a fee, just like a monthly fee. And that monthly fee will cover the parking, any sort of real estate type of rent or distribution, the labor cost for the cycle company, where it could be more like a trusted vendor type of program instead of the fleets having to contract out themselves. They basically say, all right, New York City, here's your whatever it is quarterly check. Make sure this is all taken care of the way I need it to be taken care of. I do think, though, there might be some incentives when it comes to workforce development aspect to it, where if the city can say, we can get people who don't have a college degree, maybe they fell through the cracks after high school, maybe they didn't even graduate high school, but we can get them trained in this beginning phase of a career in logistics and transportation, and that's covered by state grants, that's covered by city grants. So maybe that's a part of it where they'll say, all right, you guys pay for the parking, we'll pay for the workforce development, we'll have this third party sort of verify that this is a legitimate logistics company and a legitimate cargo bike operator, like they're insured and licensed and all that. Maybe that's the way we go forward. But certainly, as we know, if the name of the game is, well, the trucking company is going to pay for everything here, it's not going to work. That's not feasible.
Yeah, this is going to have to be a team effort to make any of this work, because as you and I both know, there's going to be an incredible number of pushback groups that don't want any trucks in their area for any reason whatsoever, even though they depend on them all the time until they don't have their groceries, the trucks are in the way, they are too loud, they're too polluting, and they're too dangerous. But until they don't get the supplies they need, then they think you can have one without the other.
Exactly. And it's so interesting you say that, because earlier this week, I put out a statement. I believe it was related to some talk about redoing the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which is a major
Absolutely.
highway and freight corridor here. And my statement was basically like, how quickly we forget that it was just a couple of short years ago, during the worst of the pandemic, that it was the truck drivers that really kept this city afloat, kept our hospitals and pharmacies supplied, kept businesses, provided that lifeline to businesses, and made sure that the end user was able to shelter in place and had everything they needed. So, from 2020, truck drivers were hailed as COVID heroes, right there on the front lines with doctors and nurses and cops and firefighters and all that, to now, again, continue to be vilified. We don't want them in our communities. Some nonsense about the pollutants, stuff like that. So it's just part and parcel for what we have to deal with sometimes among various groups. But it is important to keep an eye on the future and to say, all right, we should be treated with respect and dignity that we deserve. But that's not to say maybe we shouldn't look at some different ways of doing things either. Two things could be true at once.
Yeah, and I think it's necessary that we as a group and individuals understand that if we want cleaner, more efficient vehicles out there, and we want them in our cities, we're going to have to help fund them to get there.
Yes.
And we're just going to have to, and we're going to have to figure out a way to incorporate them in our daily lives on that last mile of delivery. And it's going to have to be necessary for you, me, everyone involved to pitch in and find a way to get it done, because otherwise we're going to have to use the same systems that we have in place. And that's not what that's not what we're talking about here, right, Zach? We're talking about creating new processes, new systems in order to create a better environment for all of us and a more efficient environment.
That's exactly it. That's exactly right. And I think part of that is, yes, the industry has to start thinking of ways to change, and like you say, ways of maybe allocating resources to fund some of this. And I think from the municipal side of it, cities should really go back to using that regulatory hammer, if you will. Maybe hammer's not the right word, but using the regulatory toolbox to say, okay, let's go back to make sure when we have a regulation in place, it is legitimately for the safety and well-being of the community. And it's not just a regulation, it's not taxation via regulation. Because the industry cannot afford taxation via regulation and to make these investments in the new technologies and new vehicles. So what I'd say is, let's make sure that every regulation has a real true safety component to it, a real true environmental component to it, and then we could start letting some other ones go, which should, of course, free up funds for fleets to then invest in this new technology, in these newer vehicles. I think it's a fair compromise between industry and municipality, without the government necessarily having to write large checks to the businesses to buy some of this equipment.
Yeah, I'm going to be, if we talk about this and as we continue to bring this forward, if you want New York City to grow both internally and externally, if you want it to understand that it has room for growth and room for betterment, these kinds of systems are necessary to be placed to make that possible for the future. Because if you're going to continue to rely on the old systems, it's not going to benefit anybody at all, because they just won't be financially feasible in the long term. And we'll still be it'll still take truckloads of diapers to come in to feed, instead of spreading the wealth.